is our first webinar focused on training users on how-to topics, and we're trying to cover, at least initially, many of the common areas where we get questions. So today's session is focused on installing Rundeck. The topic we're covering today, installing, is an area where we get a number of questions. Because it's a topic where typically you run into this as something that you hopefully only deal with once or twice as you're setting things up. This may not be relevant or as relevant for folks who've been using Rundeck a while, but we'll try to point out some best practices. And in the latter part of our session today, I'm going to do a couple of installs. Fairly basic in the interest of time, but I want to walk through some installs and show you some of the areas that we go through, and this way we'll have a recording also that we can share with new users who may have questions around this and want to be able to see an example. So that's what we're covering. Our general agenda is as follows. The first 4 topics here are general best practices and informational things, core system requirements, some considerations that are related specifically to Rundeck Enterprise, the common install methods, and key configuration files. In general, everything we're covering today is relevant whether you're using the community version or the enterprise version, but I'll call it a few specific cases where it's something that's enterprise specific. After I cover those first 4 topics, the examples will come up. We'll do an install on an Ubuntu server and then do an install on a Windows server. By doing that, we'll not only show you both Windows and Linux, which is helpful just to get a sense of the differences, but also show you 2 different types of installs. The Ubuntu will be using the Debian package, so it's a native install, if you will, and the Windows case will be using the WAR file, which is the launcher install. The install I'm doing in the Windows case isn't necessarily something you'd only do for Windows. You could use the same methodology for Ubuntu, but I'm going to show you Windows because we do have a number of Windows users, and I want to address some of those questions. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. Certainly, I would suggest if you have questions that come up as I'm going through things, add them to the Q&A, and we will try to address them as we can, either in line if it seems relevant, or we'll try and address them at the end as we get to the Q&A section. Okay, great. So, and some of these things hopefully are things you've seen before or had documented before, but in some cases I've tried to take information that was in a few different places and consolidate it to make a few points clear around some of these topics. So first thing, core system requirements. As you probably all know, if you're Rundeck users or administrators, Java is a requirement. Rundeck is a Java servlet-based server, so it requires a Java runtime environment in the place that you're going to install. You have different flavors of Java you can install. That's up to you. As long as it installs and your native OS knows that Java is there and has a path for it, you should be good to go, which typically that all kind of takes care of itself. I did want to talk beyond Java about some of the system requirements, because I don't know that we call this out clearly. There's a lot of variability, it depends on what you're doing, but here's some ballpark ideas of what your system requirements might look like depending on the nature of the Rundeck server. So if you're doing a test environment, where you're obviously not going to have a huge amount of load, the minimum is probably 2 CPUs, 4 gigs of RAM, and anywhere between 15 and 100 gigabyte storage. And the variability there has to do with a couple things. If you're keeping everything on that server, then you might want to err on the higher side. But the use of disk space is going to be partially based on how many days worth of execution logs you're holding on to, and how big the database gets over time. But for a test install, that's typically going to be pretty small. So I think it's likely you could err on the small side here. If you are setting things up with your database on its own server, then you definitely can err on the small side in terms of storage. The more typical production server is 4 CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM, and minimum probably in the neighborhood of 20, anywhere up to 300 gigabyte storage. And again, the variability here has to do with where is your database and how much other file, how many other files are you storing in terms of execution logs and the like. Once you're getting to a production server, it's pretty likely that your database is on its own server and your logs might be getting written to a shared server, a shared file location like an S3 storage or some sort of SIFS store, SMB store, something like that. So if that's the case, as is typical, then you could be in the, say, 20 to 50 gigabytes to be safe and not really need that 300 gigabyte storage. And then a large environment, 8 CPUs, 16 gigs of RAM, and again, the variability in terms of storage. Certainly, if you're looking at a large environment, then most of the storage is probably going to be offboarded to other servers based on the types of things we're talking about. If you're installing Rundeck Enterprise, think of these system requirements or kind of scoping as being per cluster member. If you're doing a community install or a Rundeck team install, then obviously there's just a single server involved. But roughly speaking, those numbers should work. So part of what I do at Rundeck as part of the customer success team is work with new customers and talk through some of the aspects that they need to consider when they're doing a new install. And many of those customers, enterprise customers, are installing the cluster version of the product where they have multiple members of the cluster that are going to be participating together in managing what's going on in the Rundeck world. So for those cases, it's really important to think about these elements, and these elements might very well be true even in a non-cluster environment. So if you're dealing with a cluster, you need to make sure you're pointing at a common external database. So the database is either a dedicated database on its own server for Rundeck, or might be pointing at a database in whatever your corporate database infrastructure is. But all the cluster members need to point to that. If you're running a community version, I'd still think if you're using it for production that you want to have the database on an external server rather than being on the same server. You also want to have log storage that is some sort of shared folder or cloud storage. Critical if you're looking at things from the cluster perspective, because you want to make sure that all the cluster members are getting the same data at the same time. You don't want there to be discrepancies where one server has some details and another server doesn't have those details yet. You can work around it if you're in the situation, but many of the questions and or trouble tickets that come up around cluster setup or usage often have to do with the fact that this common storage hasn't been set up initially. Common authentication is important as well, and in general for any production environment, I think you probably do want to have some external authentication rather than using the built-in authentication. Often that's LDAP or AD, but that depends on the nature of who in your environment is using Rundeck, how you're using it, and how you're handling role-based controls. The resource models that are associated with your nodes and other things that are in your project, those also could be in a shared file system similar to the log storage. And that's important, again, for a cluster mode so that you're not maintaining separate copies of all of your node definitions. If you can have them all pointing to one place, then as those things get edited, all the servers are maintaining the same information. Lastly, for a cluster environment, making sure you've got a load balancer in front. Doesn't really matter what that load balancer is, but something that's going to take the initial requests and is in front of the cluster members is obviously fairly important. So I'm not going to go into much detail on any of those things. We have documentation out there that gets at these, and if you have questions around it, we can follow up separately on those. But I wanted to call those out because I think those are important considerations for certain types of installation. So next, I wanted to talk about the installation methods. And if you go to our documentation and go to the installation page, you'd essentially get this same information. I'm calling it out in a little bit different way here. Essentially, there's, let's call it 3 different installation methods. There's the native installation using the native packaging, which would either be using a .deb file if you're on a variant of Ubuntu or Debian, or using an RPM if you're on CentOS or Red Hat or some flavor thereof. So those are we'll refer to those as native installations. They're native in that when you've installed, the installation is going to be placing its files in a way that's pretty compliant with the way Linux works and the way Linux expects your files to be placed. And your server is going to be aware that you have this package called Rundeck installed on it. So, there's pluses and minuses to that method. Not everybody who's installing on one of these OSs necessarily uses this method, but in some ways you could argue it's the simplest method for installation. It's like installing most any other package, but it isn't the only way. The next option is installing using what we sometimes refer to as the launcher method, or using the .war file as an executable. You can do that in 2 different ways that we've documented. You can use it as a Tomcat servlet, so you install Tomcat on that server and you configure it to launch that war file. Or you can use it as the native Java app without Tomcat, and it's using Jetty under the covers to manage that. The thing to remember about this launcher method is you're running a command line effectively that launches that war file with some parameters each time you start it. And so because of the way it's being handled, the overall OS doesn't necessarily have any sense that there's an installed application. If you were to look in your package manager for whatever OS you're in, you probably wouldn't see Rundeck there if you use the launcher method. That means that the files that are associated with the installation aren't necessarily in the kind of standard locations for the OS. Instead, they're stored underneath a base directory for that install, what we call RDEC base, which we'll see referenced here in a minute. So this is one point of confusion for people when they're first setting things up. There are a few configuration files that you're likely to want to touch as you do the installation or shortly after the installation to modify a few things, typically the name of the server and maybe the port or IP. The location of those files differs depending on whether you're using the native method of install or the launcher method. So those are the typical ways that people would handle it. The third method, and this is becoming more and more popular, is a Docker image. So building something in a containerized environment rather than something that's launching as a direct Java app or as a package. I'm not going to get into much detail on the Docker piece. I think we may do a session focused specifically on that in the future. But at the moment, it's still a small enough case that I'm going to leave it off for today's discussion and focus on the other 2 methods. So if you do want to go the Docker method, we do have some Docker images out there as well as some documentation on how to approach that. But in general, personally, I would encourage Docker if you're already very invested in Docker and understand how Docker works. I think there's some advantages to using it in that case. If you're not that familiar with Docker, I'm not sure that setting up Rundeck with Docker is necessarily an easy way to kind of ease yourself in. There are some idiosyncrasies about it that can be confusing if you haven't done it before. So I probably encourage you, if you haven't done Docker much before, to stick with either the native install or the launcher install. I did want to, before I get into the actual installs, talk about those couple of configuration files that I mentioned earlier. Primarily, there are two files you're likely to touch when you first do your installation, and that's the first two here, framework.properties and rundeck-config.properties. You'll notice I give you two different paths based on whether you are doing the native install or are doing the launcher or war install. So if you're doing the native install, these files will exist under etc Rundeck. If you're doing the launcher install, you have a base directory. As I mentioned, it's rdeck base. And then underneath rdeck base, there's an etc folder, and that's where framework.properties lives. And if you're looking for Rundeck config properties, it's under rdeck base/server/config. So just kind of worth keeping that in mind. This is all documented in the documentation, but I wanted to call it out succinctly here because I think this is important in the context of installation. There are a lot of settings in both of those, but the ones that you probably want to look for and may need to change are the ones that I've called out in those first two rows. You'll notice that they're specifically referencing the name of the server, its host name, what port it's going to listen on, what its URL is, and or address. So if we were to look at these files in my two instances, we'll see a little bit of difference in what the files are based on the way we're doing the install. So we'll see some differences, but 5 of these 6 show up in both cases. I think the server.address, if I remember rightly, only shows up in the case where we're doing the install on Windows with the launcher. So I will talk about this just for a second. The default properties is going to refer to the server as localhost. If you and should use port 4440 by default. If you don't make any changes, that's what Rundeck is going to start up on, and it's going to listen on, and it's very particular about how it's going to handle that. And additionally, there are cases, so what you may find, and you may have found this if you've done an installation before and hadn't changed these settings, you might be able to initially connect to Rundeck and then get an error because it reloads you to a different page. It does a redirect. That redirect is based on the server URL. So if the server URL is saying localhost, even if your initial connection came through some DNS address or IP address, it's going to redirect you to something based on that server URL. And if you haven't made that correct, you could end up with something that's not going to do quite what you want. So it is important, once you've done the installation and before you maybe try to do any connection to it, that you modify these settings to have a correct IP if you want to connect that way, or the correct host name that you're going to use. That's going to be both how the server thinks of itself and what it's listening as well as what you're connecting with in your browser, so that those two things match up. Today, I'm not going to try to make any changes to enable SSL. That is another level of interest in terms of some of the changes that need to happen. We'll address that, but not today. We're going to stick with the straight HTTP. Of course, if I do straight HTTP without SSL, I am potentially going to get an error in my browser, so I'll need to make sure I address that. The one thing to bear in mind is because the server is going to try to do this redirect, you may need to look for a setting in your browser, if you're not turning on SSL, that allows redirects. So I don't know if we'll see that today or not. The other two files that I wanted to call out, although we won't touch them today, are admin.aclpolicy and realm.properties. These are both default files. You may eventually not use either of these files, but out of the box, you're going to have both in play. The admin.aclpolicy is a policy file that instructs Rundeck how to handle users that are in the admin role or admin group. What permissions should they have, which is effectively everything, but that's the user you have out of the box. Realm.properties is where you have your set of users that can log into Rundeck if you're using the default authentication, which is based on this file. Once you've switched over to LDAP or Active Directory, you may or may not continue to use realm.properties, but you'd still use some ACL policy files. Probably you'd add more in addition to this, this admin, and we'll do a session that gets into ACLs and how to address that in a future session. I'm going to do an installation. Before I do the installation, I'm just going to walk through the steps. And yes, this is a lot of text, but I've tried to call out essentially every step that you need to go through to get this basic install working, including some of the changes that you might want to make. The first step is setting the host name for your machine. Potentially you can argue this is optional, but servers get a little bit idiosyncratic if you're trying to start a service or an application that's listening where the name it's listening on is different than the name that you're trying to get to. So it's certainly best practice and may be required that you change the host name of your server. So I recommend you make that change right up front. Because we're in a Linux environment, there's a couple things we need to do. I've listed 3 things. One is using the hostname CTL command to change the name. So the last piece where I said rundeck-servers, whatever the name of the server is supposed to be. You also are going to need to update your etsy.host or etsy/hosts to make sure it's got the correct host name there. And depending on the nature of your server, you might also need to update this cloud.config file, or cloud.cfg. You'll see that if you're dealing with a Linux instance that's been brought up in AWS or Azure or something like that. So the particular Linux instance I'm going to connect to today is in AWS, so this is a step I will likely do. But in your environments, many of you may not run into that. Once we've set the host name, the next best practice, again, not requirement, is to update the operating system. In this case, I'm going to use apt-get because we're in Ubuntu. But I'm going to want to update it, make sure all of the applications and libraries and whatever are as up-to-date as we can make them before we get into our install. And then the next step is install Java. And one of the things I noticed as I was preparing for this session is we don't always call this out. We tell you it's a requirement, but we don't necessarily call it out as a step in the installation. And I think you do need to think of it as that. Often you're getting a new server that's dedicated for this purpose and may or may not already have Java installed. So you at least need to check and make sure, and if it's not there, we'll install it. So that'll be one of the steps we'll do today. The 4th step is going to be downloading and then installing. We're going to be working in the command line. I'm just going to use a wget to grab the file and download it, and then I'm going to use a dpackage command to install it. Then step 5, I guess, is the configuration files, modify framework properties and Rundeck config properties. And then lastly, we'll start up Rundeck and we'll connect to it. So those are the steps we're going to go through. Hopefully everybody can see this okay. On the left hand, I've got my slide that I was just showing you in slideshow mode. On the right-hand side, I'm already connected to my Ubuntu server. I do want to change its host name. And so our first step is going to be to change the host name. So because I am not root, I'm using sudo, and I have sudo capability here. Okay, so if that had not worked, we'd get an error back, so we know that was good. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I gave it the wrong name. Okay, hang on a minute, I need to find the correct name here. And yes, if you were wondering, we're obviously operating live here today, so forgive me if I missed something. But I wanted to do it the same way that everybody else does it, and if we make a mistake, we'll correct for it. All right. Okay, good. So we've changed it to the correct name this time, and I'm going to edit my Etsy hosts. All right, so all I'm going to do is add a second line here that references the correct host name and corresponds to that IP address. If I wanted to be super clear, I could call out the exact IP address, but for my purpose, it won't matter in this case. So I've put in the host name. I'm going to save that change, and we're good there. So the last step is to edit, if it exists, Etsy cloud.cfg. All we're changing here is this preserve host name. We want to set it to true instead of false, because AWS in this case or other cloud providers have a sense of what the host name is of the machine, and if we haven't set this, they'll set it back to what they think it should be as opposed to what I know it should be. All right, so that's that. Now we're going to run the update command. Super exciting to watch, I know. There are some changes it wants to apply, so we'll go ahead and apply those changes. Obviously, in your real-world environment, you may not be the person doing some of these steps. Whoever's responsible for provisioning these machines might do that, but we do want to make sure these steps happen so we've got consistent, up-to-date applications and libraries. I noticed one thing that I am not fixing in this case is it has the wrong time zone for us, but I'm just going to leave that alone. It won't affect what we're doing today. The fact that we're getting to watch so many lives go by hopefully does reinforce that we're doing this live. If I had recorded it ahead of time, I wouldn't subject you to all of this. All right, so next thing we're going to do is install Java. There's several different packages you'll see for any given OS. I picked one. I don't know that it necessarily matters, but in general, you want to pick, if you have a choice, whatever the most recent version is for your flavor of Java. Okay, so we have Java working. We've updated the OS. There is one point I guess I'll come back to from a best practices perspective that I'm skipping today just for simplicity, and that is it's probably a good idea to install Rundeck as a separate user. Certainly don't install it as root. In this case, I'm installing as a user called Ubuntu, but I might encourage you for production purposes to actually create a Rundeck user and do all the installation and everything as that Rundeck user. I'm just skipping a couple steps there for simplicity's sake, but that's something worth keeping in mind. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to grab the file. I could actually get this file and do the installation a couple different ways, but I'm just going to grab that file using wget. I actually got this download link by going to download.rundeck.org and grabbing the link we need. So it's grabbing that file. The alternative method that would still be kind of native package is to add the Rundeck repository and then install using apt-get. We can maybe do that another time, but today I'm just doing it this way because it's pretty straightforward. So now that I have that file, I'm going to run the command that's going to do the actual install. All right, so it has installed Rundeck. So we have something that is there and we could run it, but we do want to modify a couple of files before we do that. So that is going to be my next step, and we're almost done with the basic installation on our Ubuntu server. So as I pointed out earlier, because we're doing a native installation, the files we want are all under etc Rundeck. If we were doing a launcher install as we will on Windows, they'll be in a little different location. So this is our framework file. The things that we want to edit in this case are all in this first section under Rundeck server connection information. So as I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that it's not launching as localhost because I'm not really going to connect to it from the server itself. I'm going to connect to it from where I am. So I want to make sure that that it has the proper information based on that. So I am going to replace any references to localhost with its correct fully qualified name. And I could also use an IP address. Again, this is just all based on how am I going to connect. Just remember that what I'm setting as the server URL with its port is the base that it's going to base any other page addresses on. So when it does a redirect, it's coming back to this. So if I left it at localhost, even though I might have been able to initially connect to the server, as soon as a redirect happened, I'd get an error. Okay, so that's all I'm going to change. And then we're going to edit our other file. Again, I'm going to replace localhost with the fully qualified name. Both of these files, as you get further into Rundeck, you might add other settings, or they might already have other settings in them. So we're seeing something that's pretty vanilla right now. Okay, so assuming I haven't made a mistake somewhere in here, I think we're ready to bring it up and then try to connect to it. So let me. I'm going to bring up a browser and we'll try to connect to it. So it does take it a minute or two for it to start up. So, you know, the fact that I'm being a little slow here is probably okay. Again, we're not using SSL in this case, so it's going to be an HTTP address, but I do want to make sure I'm calling out the port number, 4440, that I'm connecting to. And obviously, you need to make sure you've got firewall rules or whatever to match what you're doing here and allow what you need to do. All right. So we're there. So a couple things I'll point out here at the end of this example. We connected to it, and I logged in with the default credential, admin, and it redirected me back to this main kind of home page. If we hadn't adjusted some of the settings we did, we probably wouldn't have successfully got to this page. I also did have to make a change because I don't have SSL turned on for this page. I had to allow it to do a redirect. So that's kind of browser dependent. That was true for me in Chrome, so I'll throw that out there. I've updated my slide deck on the left side to move into the world of Windows. I am going to bring up my Windows machine on the right side here.
We did get a question on a technical one.
Okay.
Can we assume that an install in Ubuntu in a local VM should generally be the same?
Yes. Today, the Ubuntu that I installed in happened to be in AWS, but I've also done the install in my local Parallels environment, which should be the same as anything else. The only difference between what I did today and what you would do in a local VM is you wouldn't need to do that cloud config change that I made. Otherwise, it should be the same. The only thing that I would point out, though, is if by VM you mean something that is in a containerized environment, then things start to change because there's some idiosyncrasies about that. But if we're talking, you know, a VMware, Parallels, something like that, then absolutely it should be the same as what I just did. So we're going to do an install on Windows. So this actually is a local VM to me. That's a Windows VM running Windows 10. The type of installation we're going to do in this case is what's referred to on our downloads page as the self-contained launcher install, which is the file. It's a .war file that I referenced earlier. So it's going to be a little different methodology than what we did in the Ubuntu example, although in the end, we're going to get effectively the same end result, just in a different approach. So in terms of steps, there's actually 2 slides worth, but let's start with what's on this first slide. We're going to download and install Java. Again, it doesn't matter where you're getting it from, but you need to install it. Should be something fairly up to date. Then you want to download Rundeck. Then we're going to create a distinct Rundeck directory. This is going to be our RDEC base directory. And we're going to put the file we downloaded for Rundeck into that directory. Then we're going to, in our shell environment, set a variable that knows what our RDEC base is, and we're going to launch Rundeck. So by the time we get to this 4th step, we've technically started Rundeck. We're going to do a little more tweaking to make it more production ready, if you will, but the install will really be done by the time we get to this 4th step. And then we'll get into setting up a service and some other things, both on this slide and the next one.
Well, can you set the password for the Rundeck admin account during install?
Got it. So I'll answer the last question first, because it's the simplest one.
Okay.
Currently, there is not a way to set that password during the install, but you could modify it immediately after the install, and certainly that would be best practice, depending on how accessible that server is. The The Ansible role, I think the answer is no, but I will try to follow up on that and verify that. We certainly have folks that are using Ansible to install Rundeck, so it's not a question of can that be done, but I don't think there is anything out of the box that's designed with that in mind, which I think is what's being asked.
And then just one more, and then you can get back on to finish this up. Is there an official Helm chart to install Rundeck?
Is there an official which chart?
Helm, H-E-L-M.
Not that I am aware of, no. I can follow up on that one as well. There was one other question I saw related to Docker. The question was, will you do another session with Docker, or is there a step-by-step installation guide with Docker installation? There are instructions out there for Docker. I'll try to remember before we're done to maybe go to that page, but I do plan to do a Docker-related session, but it's going to be at least a few months because I know the next couple sessions won't be Docker-specific. But I can try to follow up with you and make sure you've got what you need around the Docker piece. So I've actually downloaded the files I need, so that'll save us a little bit of time. But I wanted to point out this is download.rundeck.org. So this is where you go for the community version. If you're doing the enterprise version, it's download.rundeck.com. They look a little different, but effectively what you get is the same. In this case, I grabbed this WAR file. So I've done that. I've also downloaded the Java file from here. So I've got that as well. So I'm going to skip on to the, let's see, we want to do the install first. So here's my Java installer. Let's do that. So you shouldn't have to change anything with the Java install. You should be able to just do the default install, which is what I'm doing here. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip over here, and I'm gonna create a Rundeck directory under the C drive, and that's gonna be your RDEC base. Assuming Windows wants to cooperate with me. But you could name it anything you want and obviously place it anywhere you need. All right, I want to bring this Rundeck WAR file into that directory, and we've successfully installed Java. There are ways to test that, but we'll find out soon enough if that failed for some reason. So I do want to bring up a command window to do the next couple steps, and just to be safe, because we're doing install-y type things, I'm going to run this as admin. Okay, so I'm in my Rundeck directory, and I'm going to set RDEC base. Well, we're already in it, so it doesn't matter. And then I'm going to run this command. So this command should be the command for you to run, assuming you are in the same directory as your WAR file, and assuming you grab the same version as I. This is the most current version of Rundeck Community. If you do this in the future, obviously the details of the exact version number might change over time. But you'll notice in this case, because we're running it as an executable, we're seeing feedback in our screen immediately, and that's a little different. Okay. All right. So at this point, in theory, we have a working version. It's got the wrong host name, as we can see here. So that is what we're going to correct for next, or soon. So I'm going to stop the running Rundeck just with the Control-C. All right, so we've stopped it. I am going to create, so you'll notice we're in our Rundeck directory. We've got a bunch of subdirectories that got created with the install. I'm going to create a new file. I'm actually created as a text document, although it's going to be a batch file. And we're going to call it, we're going to call it startrundeck.bat. You can call it anything you want, but we want to make it a batch file that we'll call. Well, at the moment, it's going to treat it as a, excuse me, while I deal with Windows. Okay, I'm going to open up Notepad to edit that. Okay, so our startrundeck.bat, we want to have it say this. And I made sure that the WAR file we're referencing is the correct one, but otherwise I can take this essentially as is. Okay. We are on our last slide of our main demonstration here. So I want to grab a file called nssm.exe. It's a tool that will let you easily create a service, and I have that file already downloaded. So I'm going to just copy it into our Rundeck directory. Okay, so we're going to launch that. Oops. Do something wrong. Oh, right. Okay, I put it in the directory, but I want to actually run it from here. And this is all in our Windows install instructions. So it's going to create a service for us. We want the path to point to that bat file, and it'll set the startup directory. We could do other things, but that's good enough. We're going to install a service. Okay, we're going to do our configuration options. So let me bring Notepad back. So we're in Rundeck base, and the first file I want is under Etsy, framework.properties. So I want to replace this name. In this case, I actually want to make it be a local host, just because I'm going to be referencing it from this machine. So let's save that change, and then we want to edit Rundeck config.properties. So we want to go into server config and Rundeck config.properties. So this is actually going to be the same replace command. All right, so hopefully we're good to go. So I'm going to bring up the services control panel, or management console, I guess is technically what it's called. So these are our services. If we scroll down, thanks to our handy dandy tool, we should have a Rundeck service. It's not running yet, so I'm going to start it. Obviously, because it's a service, you could set it to be a, wonder what. We're essentially at the end of what we're doing. I'm going to bring it up and we're going to log in, but that will look similar to what we just did.